Hello, welcome. This is the Bible study time. I'm Chaplain Harold Epley. Glad you're joining us again this week. We have another wonderful opportunity to look at God's Word and think about how it applies to our daily lives. We're using, as we have been for a number of months now, the book Dancing in the Aisle, Spiritual Lessons We've Learned from Children, a book my wife Rochelle Melander and myself wrote a number of years ago. And each chapter in this book tells a story of something that a child did and then reflects on how the lessons that that child learned apply to our own lives as adults and as we go throughout our lives. Today we've got, I think, a really interesting topic. The title of this chapter is entitled Cobwebs in the Corner. And it's about prophets. I don't mean P-R-O-F-I-T, the kind of when you earn some money, make a profit. I mean P-R-O-P-H-E-T. The prophets, the ones you hear about in the Bible, like the prophet Jeremiah or the prophet Isaiah. And we don't often think about prophets in our modern day world, but as we're going to share in this Bible study, prophets are really just people in life who are able to see the truth and to convey that truth to other people. And for that reason, sometimes prophets aren't always real popular. When I think about modern day prophets, I think about people like maybe Martin Luther King Jr. or others who have stood up and spoken the truth, as hard as it might be to hear. And often those prophets end up losing their life or suffering greatly for being able to stand up and say the truth. So that's what we're looking at today, and we've got an interesting passage that we're going to look at. It's a story about a prophet in the Old Testament, and this prophet maybe is not as well known as the ones who actually have books that are named after them in the Bible. This is the prophet Uriah, U-R-I-A-H. You might not recognize his name, but he has a very important role in a story about King David. And this story you might be familiar with. We know David was very held in great esteem by the people of Israel, still is to this day. He was their king who accomplished many great things. But there's some stories in the Bible about some of the less admirable things that he did. And if you were giving a rating to the story I'm going to be reading to you today, probably be rated R if it were a movie. It's a bit unsavory, some of the things that it talks about. And just to give you a little background, this is a story about David and Bathsheba. And Bathsheba was this beautiful woman that he saw one day in passing that he wanted to have. He wanted to be with her. And the problem was that she was married to somebody else. And so for that reason, when he took her into his bedroom, he committed adultery with her. And of course, God frowned on that, but the story gets even juicier because she ends up becoming pregnant, and then King David, tries to get her husband who and actually, her husband is Uriah. I misspoke the prophet's name earlier. The prophet is Nathan. Her husband was Uriah, and he was in the army. And so he was out on the battleground. So King David called for him to come home in the hopes that he would sleep with her and think he got her pregnant. And see, I told you it was rated R. And that didn't work out, so King David ends up making sure that Uriah is at the front line in the next battle, and then he gets killed. So now he's responsible not only for committing adultery, but arranging for a murder. And that's the background to this story. The prophet Nathan shows up, and we'll begin. This is told in 2 Samuel, beginning at the end of the 11th chapter, and it goes into the 12th chapter. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, he tells a parable, There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare, and drink from his cup, and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb, and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Well, then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to the prophet Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? The story goes on. It's rather lengthy, so I'm not going to read all of it, but Nathan delivers these harsh words to David. David hears that he is able to see that he's done wrong, and he repents of his actions, and the story goes on from there. But we're going to focus on the prophet part of this, because Nathan the prophet is the key in this lesson for this week. So here's our devotion, Cobwebs in the Corner. Our 7-year-old neighbor Kevin doesn't think of himself as a prophet. He just tells it the way he sees it. On a visit to our house with his mother, Kevin glanced about our humble dwelling and then declared, "You have cobwebs in the corner. You should get rid of them." His mother blushed and cast him a glance indicating that as soon as they returned home, he would receive a lecture about tactfulness. Kevin's mother didn't know it, but this wasn't the first time he had pointed out our housekeeping foibles. The previous summer, he informed us that our windows were dirty and that weeds were sprouting up through the cracks in our driveway. "You should pull those," he told us, sounding like a future highway inspector. Kevin's penchant for audacious observations is probably one of the reasons why he's not the most popular kid on the block. We appreciate him the way we appreciate the warning lights in our car. We'd rather not see him. When we do, we heed his advice. Though we sometimes find Kevin's remarks annoying, we also know that he speaks the truth. In our busyness, we tend to overlook the cobwebs and the weeds that gradually infiltrate our home and property. We grow so used to looking out spattered windows that we fail to realize that we aren't seeing clearly. Much as we hate to admit it, Kevin occasionally helps us get our lives back in order by pointing out the obvious. Perhaps Kevin is our neighborhood prophet in the truest sense of the role. Although we sometimes think of prophets as people who are able to predict the future, the actual task of biblical prophets was to clarify the present for those who were overlooking the obvious. God blessed prophets such as Jeremiah, Amos, and Hosea with the ability to clearly see what was wrong with the world and then assign them with the unenviable task of pointing it out to others. It's no wonder that prophets were not popular. One of the most moving stories about a prophet is the account of Nathan and King David. After David committed adultery with Bathsheba and then arranged for her husband Uriah to be killed, God sent Nathan to show the king the error of his ways. Nathan told a parable to David, which helped him to see the grievous crimes he had committed. David responded by repenting of his sins and asking God for mercy. The fact that adultery and murder were displeasing to God should have been obvious to David. Yet in his desire to justify his actions, David had become blind to the truth. It took the bold actions of a prophet to set him straight. In our modern world, we're not so sure about prophets. At a time when cult leaders have led many astray, we're rightfully wary of people who claim to come bearing a message from God. Still, we look to our teachers and preachers to explain how Jesus can guide our lives. However, that doesn't mean we want them to be prophetic, confusing us with the facts. Many a preacher who has dared to take on the role of truth teller on Sunday morning has awakened on Monday without a job. Others face both silence and anger from their parishioners. We might want to be followers of Jesus. That doesn't mean we want anyone telling us the truth about our lives. Yet from time to time, we all encounter people like Kevin, people who are able to see the cobwebs in our lives and aren't afraid to point them out. Often these prophetic types are children, perhaps because they have not yet learned that most people don't like to be told the obvious, especially when it is not pleasing news. But others emerge as prophets too, if only we have ears to hear. Our prophets may be the very old, people who are way beyond caring about who they might offend. Also, they may be strangers, people who can speak freely without worrying that they may have to confront the issue or the hearer on a day-to-day basis. In moments of courage and wisdom, all of us can serve as prophets. Everyone we encounter in our lives may function as a prophet for us, pointing out the obvious and pushing us to accept the truth. We may not enjoy Kevin's bold reminders to clean the cobwebs out of the corners and wash our windows. We may even find him annoying. Although we avoid him from time to time, we cannot argue the fact that we need him. Our world needs prophets. We need people who can see through the pomp and circumstance and declare the emperor has no clothes. We need people who can point to the spiritual cobwebs in our lives. For as unpleasant as it may be, we need the truth. We need to be able to look in the mirror and see the smudges of dirt on our lives. Only then can we approach God face to face and ask for forgiveness. Only then can we set out on our journey, seeing clearly, knowing who we are, where we have been, and where we are going. Prophets, that unenviable role of telling the truth when people don't always want to hear it. Think about your own life, and the first question we have for you to reflect on here is, who have been the prophets in your life? Who have been those people who have been able to point you in the right direction by sometimes telling you you're going the wrong direction? The Bible does say, speak the truth in love. And that's an important part of being a prophet. So a prophet, I know in our story here, the little boy Kevin could be a little harsh with his comments. But a true prophet speaks out of love. And they speak the truth, but they do it in a way that is going to help the person they are speaking to. They have the welfare of the person in mind. So a prophet isn't somebody who just criticizes you all the time, but it's somebody who's able to help you and guide you into the right path. I'm sure there have been people like that in your life. And another question they have here is, when have you felt that you were moved to be a prophet to others? And what happened? If you've raised children, no doubt you've had to serve that role in their lives. Sometimes they get a little off track and you have to guide them in the right direction. But maybe there are friends, other people that you have known in your life that you've been able to speak the truth to. And again, speak it in love, with their welfare in mind. A final question here is, how have you responded when you were confronted with a truth you did not want to hear? That happens to all of us. The truth can be painful. Sometimes we know we're not doing it the right way. And we don't want to be reminded of that by somebody else. But again, the reason that we have prophets and the reason they were so important in the stories in the Bible is people get off track. We all get off track. And kind of if you think of our lives as a road, a path, a highway that we follow. Of course, that road winds all sorts of directions, goes up hills, down into the valley. But sometimes we get off the road. And the prophets are there to get us back on track, to help us find our way again. So this is, a little different, our Bible study this week, thinking about people that maybe we don't think about so often, and maybe don't always think about in the kindest way, because we don't want to hear the truth. But we need those people, and we need them as a society as well. We need people who are able to look at the things that are wrong and speak boldly about them, and be willing even to risk their lives to do that. And we're seeing a lot of people like that right now in our world, and we are grateful for them, and we are all in those challenges to make our world a better place. So that's where we go with this one this week. I'll be back next week with another reflection from Dancing in the Aisle, a Bible study, and I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you then.